So, hello everybody. My name is Adam Ellsworth. I'm here to talk to you about Urbit. And just a quick show of hands, is there anybody already familiar with the project? Anybody been on the network? All right, good. This presentation is geared towards people who have no idea about what Urbit is. It is notoriously hard to explain. I'm going to try to get through as much as I can in 20 minutes. I think in a lot of ways, as we'll see this presentation, my run through it is actually going to be fairly complementary towards the second half of the agenda, just discussing big tech and social media in general. So hopefully this will prompt some questions or discussion topics for that second segment here. Again, since it is sort of a dense topic with a lot to go through, I'm actually going to start with just sort of what I'm calling the if nothing else. If you forget everything else I say in the next 20 minutes, and I promise this is the only slide I'm going to read, but just some things to think about. So Urbit's wager is that we do not have to make all of the convenience versus sovereignty and other trade-offs that are inherent with the experience of using the internet today. Urbit believes that it's possible to provide users with their own tools to be employed on their own terms, and that this can be afforded by building infrastructure with the principle of simplicity that is currently lacking. And if done correctly, it will permit the kinds of experimentation that may lead to a more vibrant, diverse, and richer internet experience for everybody. So that's sort of the high-level theme. And as we dive into what exactly is Urbit, Urbit you can think of as sort of a reimagination of the network computing stack. It makes a critique of the internet that is, in a lot of ways built off of technology that was developed in the 70s, 80s, not really leading to the vision of the internet, not leading to the reality of the internet as it was originally envisioned. So Urbit is striving to, having made their critique, finding it lacking, trying to redesign the internet from the ground up. Sort of the one catchphrase is designing the internet the way your grandmother thinks it works. My computer talks to your computer, instead of all the massive client server, huge backend databases, and all of the issues and potential trade-offs that go along with that. So what Urbit is trying to do is build an open source, decentralized communication platform where all communication takes place peer-to-peer, me to you, with no intermediaries. And so what your Urbit is, if you get on the network, your Urbit is essentially a personal server. It's your own printing press. It's a virtual computer. Then I'll explain a little bit more about what that entails in a moment. But it's a complete online identity that allows you to distribute whatever information you want to whomever you want, using whatever tools you want. And the idea is that you're a sovereign user. You're not beholden to other tech platforms, other terms of use. And so, like I said in the beginning, this is in a lot of ways pretty complementary to the second half of the discussion here, where if you think of the experience of a lot of the big tech platforms, Urbit's critique is not that they're evil or they need to go away. They do a lot of things, obviously, very well, and they serve a lot of people. And the architecture by which they do that with the client-server model, there are trade-offs. It's acknowledging that there are trade-offs there, and that there may be different ways to do that. Certainly, I think we're all familiar with some of the behavioral issues and incentives and other things that align to make some of these experiences maybe not optimally healthy or enriching for the human experience. We sort of see all that manifesting with attention spans and other behavioral manipulations and just what sort of how being on these platforms in general just kind of shunts the experience of creating content, et cetera, et cetera. And so Urbit is saying that, all right, it acknowledges nobody wants to be a server admin. That's a pain in the ass, right? It requires a lot of technical knowledge that most people, quite frankly, don't want to learn. So again, there is this huge appeal in terms of convenience. Urbit's question is, what happens if you give everybody the tools to essentially be on parity with that experience, for everybody to be able to own their own tools, publish their own content, and do it with the simplicity that's inherent in the current paradigm. So how do you rebuild the architecture of the internet fundamentally that it gives the users control and, again, doesn't make as many of these trade-offs as we have in the current system. So while I'm describing the system, you'll find that the philosophy behind it and the tech are heavily intertwined. So it's almost hard to separate one from the other. So I plan on the talk on covering both. And so without further ado, jumping into basically when you install or initiate or boot up your Urbit, kind of how is it functioning? So there's, at a very high level, these are the main components of the Urbit system. You have Arvo, which is your Urbit OS, and it's a purely functional operating system. This is sort of a unique approach as far as computing goes, where, what do I mean by purely functional? Well, it's a pure mathematical function in that your Urbit is actually housing an immutable event log. So every single action that takes place on your Urbit, any single action that you use or do or use it for, is recorded on the event log. And your event log is deterministic in the sense that if you replay it starting from event 0, you will get exactly to the current state of your account, which in Urbit parlance is called a ship. And we'll get to the Urbit IDs in a moment. But so the idea is that you can recreate your entire state of your Urbit machine from scratch if you ever needed to, just by virtue of the fact that every single transaction is recorded in this event log. So Arvo is essentially an event handler. It is taking all of the events, kind of dispersing responsibility for determining what they are, how they get processed. It does that by interacting and directing events to these 10 control veins, which I'm not going to get into, but you can see that they handle various computational aspects of the system that would arise in any normal computing environment. And everything essentially is translated by knock, which is a Turing complete function. It's noted for its sort of ruthless approach to minimalism and simplicity, in that it only has 12 opcodes. So everything that gets computed in Urbit by knock and eventually written to your event log is done so using this extremely simplistic, minimalistic, frozen instruction set. And that's going to get into a lot of the core principles behind the project in terms of simplicity, durability, longevity that I'll touch on. Sort of, as I mentioned, your Urbit is a virtual computer. Typically, it's hosted on some sort of Unix environment. That is another feature of the design where, in order to build something that is durable and long-lived, it has to be hardware agnostic. So the idea going forward is that you'll be able to port your Urbit to any environment in which it can be hosted. And as I mentioned right now, that's typically a Unix environment. So Ver is actually the Urbit runtime. It's the intermediary or sort of switchboard layer that operates among all the Unix processes, and it will take events, inputs, whether that's receiving packets or keystrokes, etc., and that'll translate them into sort of a knock-friendly Urbit equivalent that the system can then process. And your Urbit is totally portable. So if you wanted to host it under another environment, if you want to keep moving between systems, you can export your event log and your data and port it to any system. And like I said, since the event log is this immutable, deterministic, just persistent state that's maintained by your Urbit, you can just reboot it again and start where you left off on any new platform. Jumping on to the Urbit Identity that facilitates communication across the Urbit system. There was a question that came up earlier. So this is Urbit's tied to Ethereum, but essentially your Urbit Identity is a cryptographically secure NFT. It is managed by a system called Azimuth, which is Urbit's identity system. It's essentially a public key infrastructure that's comprised of various ETH contracts and that facilitates the communication over Urbit's peer-to-peer network. The peer-to-peer network, that's actually a vein of Arvo called AIMS that we saw on the last slide that facilitates the networking communication in conjunction with some other of the veins. But this is what enables the secure encrypted peer-to-peer communication across the network. And on Urbit, you own your identity, and that's crucial. It's a sort of one-stop, full-stop identity solution for any interactions that you have on Urbit with other ships, other users, etc. And so identities are scarce, they're immutable, and they're persistent across all communication and Urbit apps. And my Urbit ID, and all of them are actually, they're essentially just numbers on the azimuth system, this being my point number, but they're represented in a couple of different ways. They're sort of pseudonymous by default. I'm, of course, outing myself as an Urbit user and giving this talk, which is fine. But they're all rendered in these sort of mnemonic representations. Mine is pronounced Nospex Larset, and so everybody has these funny little sci-fi names that are associated with their Urbit ship, and it's up to the users. Some people maintain this pseudonymity to the grave. Others are, just call me Adam or Jack or whatever my name is. And they also get represented as these sigils, which, again, it's sort of a frivolous but kind of nice aesthetic touch, but essentially both of these are ways that the system is just representing this number in your communications with other ships across the network. One other thing that's interesting about the Urbit Identity system is their distribution of address space. You'll notice there is basically a sci-fi theme going through the project to some extent, but there's three main levels of Urbit address space, and those are galaxies, stars, and planets. Planets or ships, sort of interchangeable term. That's the main single user level account across the Urbit network. So Nospex Larset is my ship or my planet. I communicate with your planets or your ships. And there's 4 billion total planets. Planets can actually, that are spawnable from the Urbit universe. I should note that it's currently still a very small project. It's only within the last year or so that it's become very easy to get on the network. Prior to that, you had to go through, for a non-technical user, a relatively daunting installation and boot up process. There's since been a lot more just single click, easy onboarding access. So, but that said, there's still only about 4,000 plus active users. So it still remains a very small project, mainly been focused on building the infrastructure over the last couple of years. But so the point there is, out of the 4 billion planets, there's still plenty left available. Planets can also spawn what are called moons, which are sort of non-sovereign identities that are kind of slave to the host or the planet that spawn them. And people use those for utilities, things like hosting groups on the Urbit network. There's a lot of work going towards like Internet of Things sort of applications. So people might use them for like Raspberry Pi or other controllers. A lot of just interesting emerging use cases. Like I said, as more people get on the network, they're going to just find more experimentation and things to do with it. The next level up from planets is stars. And you can think of stars as basically infrastructure within the Urbit network. They are responsible for a lot of packet distribution, routing, discovery. They basically do for planets what the next level up, which is galaxies, do for stars, galaxies being the highest level of infrastructure. Just aid, you can think of them again as governance or routing nodes, and they aid discovery. And when there are what Urbit calls OTAs, or over-the-air updates, that get sent out over the network with just upgrades to the system, that's all routed through this structure. So the galaxies disseminate those, they find their way to the stars distribute them to the users. And as a user, if you don't like something your star is doing, you can switch. There's, the network is distributed and decentralized by design, but even within that, you have room to maneuver around if you want to adjust something. And so this is where I'm going to tie a lot of the design principles back to the architecture of the system, with what it has in mind as its goals over the long term. Again, I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, it was really conceived of as a reaction to a lot of where the internet experience as we currently use it today has ended up, and just the notion that, through the system of principled redesign, we can end up in a better state. And so it's, one thing that I like as a user coming to Urbit is just the principles with which they're approaching the project in general. I don't come at it. I'm actually a less technical user than you'll find on your average Urbit user to be. And I'm, like I said, I'm mostly into a lot of the principles. I don't come at it from this sort of rabid maximalist, Urbit is going to win. I'm just very intrigued by a lot of these ideas that are sort of embodied within the project. And one of them is this concept of durability. And nobody cannot accuse Urbit of being ambitious. One of its goals is to be this, what it calls a 100-year computer, a computer that you can pass down for generations. And so how would you go about inventing a thing like that? As I mentioned, one of the core principles behind the design of the project is just being deterministic, that this thing is rugged and durable across time. As long as your event log is intact, I could take my ship offline for 40 years, and because your Urbit is portable and not tied to any hardware, my kid could boot it up and say, oh, it was Dad doing back when he was the weird internet person, and boot up the Urbit and, pick up where the event log left off. Along with that, there's a sort of single level store structure to the memory. So instead of having operating memory or RAM adjacent to a hard drive process, there's only one level of memory for Urbit. So there's no such thing as, oh, my computer crashed or shut. Well, it can crash, certainly, but there's no just loss of that operating memory or RAM. An event happens, it goes in the event log, and there's only just one level of memory. It basically stores everything in an ACID database to protect against that kind of loss. Your Arvo is also essentially a solid state interpreter. I mentioned the over-the-air updates before. When Urbit upgrades go out, it's not like a packaged binary that then needs to be extracted and compiled and run. It just receives the code as is, and Arvo interprets that and just runs the updates on the fly. So these all kind of lend to this point of durability and just making sure that the thing works with as few intermediary layers as possible. Along with that, the decentralization aspect. There's, like I said, 256 galaxies, 65,000 stars. There's no single failure point on the network. You can receive these updates from different sponsors. As long as one is up and running and has room, you can plug into it and continue to operate your Urbit. Another interesting thing, owing to this principle of durability, that is, I think, unique to Urbit is this concept of Kelvin versioning. So every other software release operating system, you get version 1, version 1.5, version 2, et cetera, et cetera. Urbit's actually counting down to 0. They're trying to make their code base as ruthlessly simple and minimalistic as possible over the long run. So it's more about optimizing and stripping out versus adding layers and layers of bloat and glue. It's about figuring out how do you make this thing diamond perfect so that it doesn't need to have sophisticated users who, individually are incapable of understanding the entire system. Right now, Arvo is 2,000 lines of code-ish. The entire Urbit code base is somewhere between 30 and 40,000 lines, I think. So compare that to any Unix build or Linux build that's in the millions. No single person can understand what's going on. And qualifying that, obviously, to be fair, Urbit is a fairly new thing. It doesn't have the extensive libraries and other decades of add-ons that have been, building on some of these other platforms. But the intention is very much to keep it that way and keep it from getting bloated over time. So the idea is that and this, depending on who you talk to, this will take decades, if not more, but the idea is to get all the aspects of the Urbit system down to Kelvin zero, at which point it is essentially frozen and will require the maintenance of a cactus if all goes well. And so that is the durability principle. Sort of hand in hand with that, there's also just this very ultra simplistic aesthetic of minimalism that goes along with it. And you'll see some of these are overlapping and they'll repeat. So we already talked about knock. This very simplistic 12-set opcode instruction set that is already frozen. Urbit has the benefit in terms of simplicity of being a clean slate project, right? There's no legacy code. All the components are very modular. You saw the 10 veins in Arvo. May or may not be more veins in the future, but they all have very singular functions. They've actually removed some veins since it was originally conceived, as the project has been optimized. So like I said, it's very much about optimizing, being clean, not just leaving things that are just going to be vestigial and not maintained, but it's about just being as efficient as possible with the code. I mentioned this kind of ethos of zero-click maintenance eventually, as everything is frozen, the maintenance required burden of a cactus. I mentioned the hardware agnosticism. Again, owing to simplicity, you don't have to create all these driver or intermediary layers. You basically just have Arvo, and as long as Ver can talk to the underlying environment that it's hosted on, you can port it to any hardware and any OS that can support it. Decentralization, obviously a big theme with the project. The peer-to-peer network is obviously exemplary of that. Direct communication with no intermediaries. There's no point to censorship or top-down control. As I mentioned, if something happens within your sponsor star or galaxy, you can simply move your ship out and go to another one. The hierarchical address space with the distributed and the redundant routing is kind of the same idea. I mentioned the aspect of portable data. As long as you can export your event log and get it to another environment, you can just pick up where you left off, thanks to the immutability of that. And then with the decentralization, one aspect that's a little bit, it emphasizes the decentralization and empowering the user, but it kind of, the same way, doesn't talk much about depowering or deleveraging, where the power is today. So if you think of big tech and all the users in the network effects that go towards, maintaining that gravity of, I'm on Instagram, I'd like to leave. There's some of the tooling that I don't like. They come out with updates and, certain features, I wake up the next day and a feature I liked is not there anymore or something changes. Love to leave, but all my followers are here, all my data's here. Even if I export it, it's like, what can I do with it? Part of Urbit's mission very much is to take that leverage, those trade-offs back and put them in the hands of the users. So if I'm distributing my own content to users that are essentially just subscribing to my ship, I don't have that overhead of being stuck on any one of the big tech platforms and operating purely under their terms. I'm much more sovereign. I can take that power back as a user, but it also deleverages them and maybe makes them think, how do we have to retain users? It's, very contrary to the current big tech business model. Again, not that it's necessarily inherently bad or evil, just that Urbit thinks there is a different way to achieve the same, capabilities and powers to users much more simply and on their terms. Sovereignty, again, getting a little bit redundant at this point, but we already mentioned the ownership of your Urbit ID, of all your data in your event log. Another thing we didn't touch on is the concept of reputation on the network, or your owning your social graph. Certainly in your communities on Facebook, Instagram, whatever, you have your peers that you interact with. Urbit is trying to figure out, how do we do that across every single app or platform that could be built? And so there's pretty interesting work being done right now about how would you create and manage a social graph for every app that you interact with. And so they're developing protocols, and it'll be up to the app builders actually to figure out yeah, how do you integrate these? How do you manage them? How are different apps going to leverage it? But it's very much this interesting culture of experimentation that's taking place on Urbit. And now that the infrastructure is in place, we're seeing a lot of exciting things that are happening with that. I think first and foremost with sovereignty, the aspect of just having your own printing press by owning your own personal server is very much the core of the project. That is what a lot of people are highlighting now. If you ask them, what is Urbit? The simple answer is it's your personal server. And along with that, and in terms of being able to create and distribute content, a lot of companies are working on just, okay, how do we get efficient crypto rails into payments so creators can monetize, get paid for their work? The functionality is there, sort of in a nascent state already, but you wouldn't want to have large amounts of crypto sitting on your Urbit at present. It's good for small peer-to-peer transactions. That absolutely works. You can send whatever tokens you want, but it's still a little ways away from kind of large-scale crypto adoption, but that appears to be coming imminently. I mentioned portable data. Customization, another huge aspect of Urbit. Get into this a bit in the next slide, but there's actually, Urbit has its own native programming language called Hoon. It's homoiconic in the sense that the data constructs and the apps in Hoon all share the same structure. And so you can have this kind of very composable environment. It doesn't require necessarily that you as a user go out and learn a programming language. There are a lot of resources, a lot of tools being built that will allow you to customize your Urbit in ways that you can't customize your online experience now. If you think back in the early days of like MySpace and Twitter, when you could actually have your own user-generated tooling and APIs that were enabled you to customize those experiences before those got taken away. That's sort of in a nutshell what Urbit is trying to recreate, that whole culture of experimentation through those capabilities.
Another minute or so.
Yeah, I'm just about wrapping up. Covered a lot of the dev experience already in the previous slides, the composability. If you are interested in learning and developing on Urbit, there is a very robust and supportive network that's growing on the platform. A lot of resources. There's basically an Urbit Foundation that is responsible for providing people with access to, like I said, Hoon is the programming language, and then you can get into all kinds of application or Urbit core development through that. Talked about the permissionless culture of experimentation. Despite not being very familiar to a lot of people in general, there are a number of companies that are established, have received funding, investment dollars that are starting to build unique and exciting things on Urbit. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they're doing various interesting things in terms of some of the, social graph protocols, building tooling, crypto rails. A lot of companies involved in ZK rollups and integrating those sorts of things with Urbit, as well as just a lot of, building peer-to-peer communications tools for use on the network. Anybody who has access to the recording of this slide here, just as I mentioned, getting onto Urbit prior to 2023 was this year was fairly difficult, but now there's a lot of just single-click hosting providers, also hardware for you to run your own Urbit ship. If you choose to go that route, there's a number of options that make it very easy to get on the network. Happy to help anybody who's interested get set up there if there's questions after. And speaking of questions, I think that takes me to the end.